everybody to the opening night of Marxism 2015. Marxism is a whole weekend of discussion and debate with over 90 sessions on radical history, the struggle for gender and sexual freedom, discussions on imperialism, the social history of things, philosophy, introductions to Marxism, a film festival, and concerts. It is a weekend that is not to be missed, and we really encourage you all to stick around and come and attend all of those sessions with us this weekend. The theme of tonight's panel is Voices of Resistance. And we have for you tonight a number of our keynote speakers from across the globe, all from the front lines of struggle against injustice and racism. And I'm going to introduce them as we go along tonight. My name's Rebecca Baragos. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative's Brisbane branch, and I will be your chair for this evening. Before we get started tonight, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and also acknowledge any elders that might be in the room tonight. It was advertised that Indigenous activist from the Northern Territory, Kylie Sambo, would be speaking tonight. Unfortunately, she can't make it as she has to attend to sorry business. But despite Kylie's absence, we felt it urgent to say something at this juncture about the struggle for Aboriginal rights in Australia today. At present, the WA government of Colin Barnett is acting on its intention to forcibly close 150 Aboriginal communities. The closure of Aboriginal communities threatens to make over 15,000 Aboriginal people refugees in their own country. Abbott has backed this latest land grab on the basis that the government can't afford to subsidise the lifestyle choices of Aboriginal people living on their country. Aside from the racism that this comment embodies, we know there are a set of lifestyle choices that the Australian government is more than happy to subsidise. Those are the lifestyle choices of the mining bosses, the Gina Rineharts, the Andrew Forrests, who receive over $5 billion a year in federal subsidies and billions more in state subsidies and tax breaks, and whose profits rest on the continued theft of Aboriginal land. Meanwhile, the Aboriginal government has cut over $500 million in funding to Indigenous programs for health, education and legal services. And the effect is to absolutely intensify a war on Aboriginal people and their communities that has been waged by successive governments in this country, both Liberal and Labor. The effect of those policies, government policies, has been that in the past 7 years, the number of Aboriginal children stolen from their families has increased by 60%. Rates of youth suicide have skyrocketed. The Kimberley now has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, and the rates of imprisonment of Aboriginal people have doubled over the past decade. Western Australia now incarcerates Aboriginal people at a rate 9 times the rate of black imprisonment in apartheid South Africa. This is a racist disgrace. But Aboriginal people have never been passive victims of genocide and oppression. The history of Aboriginal resistance in this country is a proud 227-year history spanning from invasion to the present, as thousands of Aboriginal people and their supporters have rallied against the closure of the WA communities all across Australia in the past few weeks. Socialist Alternative stands alongside Indigenous people and in solidarity with their struggle. We assert that the struggle for socialism is entirely bound to the struggle for sovereignty, land rights and economic and social justice for Aboriginal people, and it's a fight to abolish the disgusting racism upon which the capitalist system has been built from here all around the world to the United States of America. And so I'm very pleased to now introduce to you our first speaker of the evening, KHURY Petersen-SMITH. He is a leader of the explosive Black Lives Matter uprisings that have swept the United States since the police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson. He's also an activist of the International Socialist Organisation in Boston. And in 2009, he was a member of a peace convoy against US imperialism and Israel's policies of genocide in Palestine to Gaza. Please make him very welcome.
On the day that I arrived here in Australia a few days ago, the police in Boston, where I live, killed a black man. His name was Angelo West, and his body was left on the concrete for 5 hours, even longer than the 4.5 that Michael Brown's body lay notoriously on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri, when he was killed last summer. Angelo's family is now living one of the worst fears among families of black people in the United States today. It's not just that your loved one will be killed and his or her body desecrated. That is the beginning of a now familiar chain of events in which the media demonize your loved one as a thug and praise her or his killer as a hero. In the case of Angelo West, a cop was shot and injured as well, giving the city government and media even more license to smear Angelo and praise his killer. Had the police killed Angelo West a couple years ago, there likely would not have been a protest response. Now, this isn't just hypothetical. We know this because the cops did kill a black man a few years ago in Boston, whose name was Bo Ramsey White. He happened to be unarmed. And there was no protest response. There was anger, but no protest. However, today, there is organizing in response to the murder of Angelo West. And I bring this up to illustrate what remains the same and what has changed since the uprising in Ferguson last August. Unfortunately, police killing of black people in the United States is a painfully regular occurrence. There is no doubt that Angelo was one of several black people killed this week by police, by security guards, and vigilantes. This happens roughly every 28 hours in the United States. It's not new. The spectacular uprising in Ferguson, in and of itself, did not stop the functioning of an American state whose daily business is oppressing and killing black people, and has been for several hundred years. What has changed, and what has resulted from the Ferguson uprising, is that now we are saying no. We've begun to say that you can't harass us and kill us with impunity. We've begun to fight back. When the people of a town that you'd never heard of and that most people in the United States had never heard of, Ferguson, Missouri, rose up last summer, they didn't know what they were starting. They didn't know that they were igniting a fire whose fuel had been built over decades. They didn't realize that they would spark a nationwide outpouring of protest in solidarity with Michael Brown. They didn't know that they were actually, what they were doing in Ferguson was preparing us for our own revolts all around the country. Not only to respond to the St. Louis grand jury's decision not to indict Darren Wilson, the murderer of Michael Brown, in a badge, but they were also preparing us to rise up in response to the non-indictment of Eric Garner's killers in New York. It's worth noting that Eric Garner, who was strangled on the streets of Staten Island in New York City, was killed at the beginning of last summer, actually before Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. When the NYPD killed Eric, there were protests, but they were fairly muted. Well, the rebellion in Ferguson changed all of that. When the killer cops were let off the hook in St. Louis in New York, which took place within the same week, by the way, there were protests in 126 cities across the United States. And that was just the beginning. Protesters in every major city in the country shut down highways. And so you had this experience of every day checking the news to see images of protesters marching on the highways in New York, in Washington, in Chicago, in Seattle, in Boston, in Los Angeles. Again, every major city in the country. And that's not all. We shut down bridges and tunnels. In New York City, they shut down all the major bridges and tunnels leading in and out of Manhattan. Stopped subway trains and commuter trains. In Boston, where I live, we had a march of 10,000 people. And people just converged on the main park in the downtown. And when a few thousand would gather, we would just break off and march somewhere to shut down parts of the city. And then thousands more would gather and then march off to shut down more parts of the city. People, I didn't realize all that was shut down. We didn't find out until watching the news later what had happened, that people marched onto the train tracks of the trolley system, which you guys call the tram, to shut down the subway and things like that. In Manhattan, at one point, they shut down the Apple store. I was like, yeah, fuck it, shut it down. You know? In fact, the whole ethos of those days in the fall could really be summed up in that 3-word phrase that we chanted in the streets and that we put in hashtags on the internet: shut it down. Yeah. And thank you. I was told that you guys might be interested in chanting with me, and by that response, I thought it might be cool. So I just to say what we would say all across the country was: Eric Garner, Michael Brown, shut it down, shut it down. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, shut it down, shut it down. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, shut it down, shut it down. So when our freedom fighters rose up in August in Ferguson, they didn't know that so many people would not only stand with them, but had been waiting. I mean, so many of us, it was like, I've been waiting my whole life for this. And there's so many stories, of course, of what happened, and that these indicators of how much this thing spread. And I don't have time to tell you all of them, which is why you've got to stay for the whole conference and come on Sunday. We'll talk. But I just want to share one about student protest. So, of course, there were tons of protests of students, of public university students, of private university students. There were, in some cases, even protests for specialized students, specialized courses of study. So, for example, there was a day of action just for medical students. It was called White Coats for Black Lives. And students at 40 medical schools across the country had protests, actually. So, but it wasn't just med students and college students. There were high school students protesting and even middle school students. These are 12 and 13-year-olds as well. And there's a city south of where I live called New Bedford, Massachusetts. And in that city, these second graders at a school decided to have a protest. These are 7-year-olds. They, of course, had seen what was going on, and they decided on their own to organize a protest. And so their teacher let them in class make signs with paper and markers, and then during their recess, they walked out and they had a protest. And the reason we know about this is that one of the children who was part of the protests, her father was a cop. And when she went home that night, she asked her dad, "Daddy, why do you kill black people?" And he wasn't happy with that. Alerted the media, and so that's how we know. But just to give you a sense of how this thing spread. So it's not just that it spread across the country, though. People in Ferguson and those of us elsewhere outside of Ferguson in the U.S. didn't know that people in Palestine would stand with us, that they would send messages of solidarity on Twitter and tips about how to deal with tear gas, that democracy activists in Hong Kong would march with a hands up, don't shoot gesture, and that people as far away as Australia would follow the struggle apparently very closely, because your questions from me are very detailed. You guys are like, about this, the governor of Missouri, Jay Nixon. I'm like, most Americans don't know the name of the governor of Missouri. You guys are on point. So I want to say a word about why it took so long for this resistance, because it really is the response to a 4-decade assault on the whole U.S. working class and oppressed sections, women, gay people, immigrants, and so on, particularly black people, in the forms of mass incarceration, the dismantling of any anti-poverty programs and of affirmative action and other institutional measures to ameliorate institutional racism. On one hand, the police killing of black people on a large scale seems like a straightforward spark for a new movement against racism, because it's such a violent form of racist state oppression. But there's a flip side, of course, and that is that we become so used to the cops harassing and killing black people, the precise function of which is to terrify the population into obedience or at least acceptance of a position on the bottom of American society. And this points to the significance of the rebellion in Ferguson. It's not just that they protested when Michael Brown was killed. That was important, but then when the state mobilized 2 local police departments to put down the rebellion, they kept on marching. When they mobilized the state police, they kept on marching. When they mobilized the National Guard, which is the domestic branch of the military, they kept on marching. When they deployed tear gas, they kept on marching. When they declared curfews, they broke them. In Missouri, in anticipation of the announcement of the non-indictment of Darren Wilson, who was Michael Brown's murderer, the governor of Missouri, Jay Nixon, declared a state of emergency. This allowed him to suspend the law and mobilize the National Guard again. Now, this happened a week prior to the announcement of the non-indictment. That is, before any protests were organized, they went ahead and declared a state of emergency in preparation for the protests that they anticipated in response to the non-indictment. The state's preparation wasn't just local to Missouri. The FBI issued a bulletin to every police department in the United States, warning that they should anticipate threats to property and law enforcement in protests. The message was very clear. Get your riot gear ready, your tear gas, your jails, and so on to deal with all of these protests. Now, this found expression in particular ways locally. So in Boston, the police actually emailed every single college student in the city via their university email addresses through their university administrations. The explicit message was, we hope for peaceful protests in response to this decision. But the implicit message is, we're watching you, and we have the enthusiastic cooperation of your university administrations. The Boston police also sent automated telephone calls to every middle school and high school student in the city of Boston. So 12 through 18-year-olds got a phone call from the chief of police about the protests, all sending the same message. So, of course, this nationwide coordination of police, between police departments was orchestrated by the Obama administration, albeit not publicly. And of course, the protests came anyway. The idea was to intimidate the protests from even mobilizing, to get us to not turn out on the streets. But actually, when we did, more militantly than ever, it was actually the cops who backed down in those weeks. It was clear, actually, that because of what the uprising in Ferguson did, really shake the country, it was clear that there was a directive to police departments to go easy on the protests. And there's something very satisfying about marching onto a bridge and seeing the cops kind of have to stand there. In their panic, the US ruling class betrayed their fear of black revolt. Because of the centrality of racism, and anti-black racism in particular, to the rule of the 1% in the United States, black struggle has a way of exposing the whole of a deeply oppressive and barbaric society, whatever they may say about the US being the world's greatest democracy. Further, black struggle tends to galvanize solidarity and inspire other oppressed groups of people to resist. Now, this is important. If there's anything more terrifying to the US ruling class than black revolt, it is solidarity with black revolt by people who are not black. In this way, there are not as many rallies today in the US as there were in the fall, and yet there is forward motion of the movement, I would argue, as the struggle matures, because there is actually more of that solidarity. And this points to the significance of the recent protests in Madison, Wisconsin, actually, which came a few weeks ago in response to the killing of a 19-year-old unarmed man named Tony Robinson. Whereas, to understand the significance of what's happened in Madison, And I'll just say what happened. I mean, thousands of high school students walked out of multiple schools twice in the week after his killing, marched on the state capitol building and occupied it, and then marched to the city hall and confronted the mayor of this city, which there's this incredible video of this jackass mayor on YouTube trying to speak to these high school students with a megaphone and being drowned out by teenagers. But to really understand the significance, you have to understand the difference between Madison and Ferguson. Ferguson is this overwhelmingly black town in the South, in Missouri, which is a former slave state. It's got an all-white police force and an all-white city government. So there's something straightforward about protests there because the town is so reminiscent of Jim Crow racism, and the protests are so reminiscent of the civil rights movement. Madison is a northern city. It's overwhelmingly white. And it is a college town that has this reputation for being progressive. And so the significance here of such a revolt in Madison is twofold. First, after the rebellion in Ferguson, mayors across the country went all out to say that what happened in Ferguson is because of specific problems in Ferguson. But this city is not Ferguson. Seattle is not Ferguson. Boston is not Ferguson. Madison is not Ferguson. Well, when you kill us, it shows that actually this is not just a problem specific to Ferguson, but this is an American problem, actually. The other thing, though, is that we saw that not only will black people fight back against racism, but other people who are not black will also fight back against racism. And so those marches of high school students, though led by militant black radical youth, were actually largely white in this largely white city, which is incredibly important. Thank you. This is the greatest significance of the term black power. It is not only the historic ability of black people to revolt ourselves, but to mobilize a fight beyond and in solidarity with the black population and with a deep rejection of the system. Frankly, it is that solidarity, ultimately working class solidarity, that makes black liberation possible. It is also what makes human liberation possible. That is, there can be no socialist revolution without black liberation, and there will be no liberation of other oppressed people without black liberation. Now, I don't want to overstate it because we're in the early stages of a movement, but we have seen glimpses of more of that potential solidarity. Solidarity of the Black Lives Matter movement with Palestine. And actually, there was a fairly well-publicized delegation of activists from Ferguson going over to Palestine to stand in solidarity. The question of LGBTQ oppression and liberation have been at the center of the Black Lives Matter movement from the very start. And in fact, activists have raised the rallying cry that trans lives matter in the face of an onslaught of murderous violence against transgender people in the United States, particularly or overwhelmingly black transgendered people, other transgendered people of color. Similarly, Native Lives Matter has emerged in reference to the long neglected struggle of indigenous peoples in the US. It will come as no surprise to people here that, of course, indigenous people in the US are treated horrendously and abused by the police. Now, solidarity from one colonial settler state to another. In the face of a new wave of violent Islamophobia, Muslim Lives Matter has been raised. And between a focus on Palestine and a recognition of racism against black people and Muslims, there is actually now new and unprecedented collaboration between black student organizations and Muslim student associations on college campuses across the country. And then there's the Fight for 15. Now, I should explain what the Fight for 15 is. This is a labor struggle to demand a $15 an hour minimum wage, which is to say that in the US, we aspire to someday achieve what you comrades in Australia got like several decades ago. There have been these militant protests, and in several cities, at least in Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh, and Boston, probably more, there were direct connections made between Fight for 15 protests and Black Lives Matter protests. In Minneapolis, striking workers at a Burger King actually joined a Black Lives Matter march when it happened. Do you guys have Burger King here? You do? Okay. So I'm sorry that you guys have that. The corporate slogan in the U.S. is Burger King, have it your way. So that day we had it our way with labor fighting for black solidarity. As socialists, we understand the significance of the struggle against racism being linked to the struggle of labor. And again, I don't want to overstate it because both the Fight for 15 and the Black Lives Matter movement each face their own challenges as new movements in each struggle, activists trying to figure out our next steps and crucially how to organize ourselves. But we see that potential. And it's on that note that I want to close. Because as revolutionaries, we appreciate struggles not only for what they are today, but for the possibilities that they represent in the future. I want to read from the words of the great Caribbean socialist, C.L.R. James. And this is him speaking to a group of socialists in the United States in 1948. And he's talking about the African-American population and its relationship to the class struggle in the US. Let us not forget that in the Negro people, there sleep and are now awakening passions of a violence exceeding perhaps, as far as these things can be compared, anything among the tremendous forces that capitalism has created. Anyone who knows them, knows their history, is able to talk to them intimately, watches them at their own theaters, watches them at their dances, watches them in their churches, reads their press with a discerning eye, must recognize that although their social force may not be able to compare with the social force of a corresponding number of organized workers, the hatred of bourgeois society and the readiness to destroy it when given the opportunity should present itself rests among them to a degree greater than in any other section of the population in the United States. That potential remains. Its emergence and transformation from potential to power will take time and experience and victories and defeats and betrayals and struggle. And it will rise and fall with the rise and the fall of the class struggle as a whole. As revolutionaries in the United States, in league with you all in Australia and our comrades around the world, we will do everything we can to build this fight as part of the global fight for human freedom. Thank you.
KHURY will also be speaking at 11:30 on Sunday, so make sure that you don't miss it by coming along to the rest of the conference and seeing him speak there again. The struggle for the civil rights of oppressed minorities has been a feature of many countries across the world, and we are actually very lucky tonight to have one of the legends of the civil rights struggle in Northern Ireland, EAMONN McCANN, with us. EAMONN was one of the leaders of the movement in the 1960s in Derry, in the north of Ireland, for the rights of the Catholic minority, who were discriminated against in jobs, in housing and education. He is a survivor of the Bloody Sunday massacre of January 1972, which saw 14 civil rights protesters killed by British forces. Since that period, he has never given up the battle against injustice. He's been a lifelong working class fighter, a champion of the oppressed. He's been hauled most recently through the courts for his participation in a pro-Palestine protest. And he writes widely on a huge variety of topics, from the wars in the Middle East to austerity across Europe. Please make EAMONN welcome.
I was telling KHURY earlier that I used to have a haircut like his. It's true. I really did. I mean, it was just a natural thing. And actually, when I had hair like that, people used to say that I had an Angela Davis haircut, which actually made me feel very good. I mean, I'm not boasting about this. It's absolutely true. People say that he's the guy with the Angela Davis haircut. And one of the reasons that made me feel so good at the time is that where I come from, sort of, and where our civil rights movement began, people consciously modelled it on, and they liked modelling sort of our civil rights movement on the black civil rights movement in the United States because of it was, I hesitate to say romantic, but there was an attachment to it, sort of that these were the coolest revolutionaries in the world. I mean, I'm sure it didn't feel like that if you were marching in Selma or somewhere, but nevertheless, sort of that's the way it seemed. Actually, the biggest, loudest, most prolonged piece of applause I have ever heard in my life sort of occurred at about 2 o'clock in the morning in January in 1969. Sort of, it was in front of a gable wall, which has now become sort of icon of the struggle in Northern Ireland, which says, "You're now entering free Derry." If I get time, sort of, if I don't run out of time, I'll tell you the story about how that came about, sort of, which is also a story of solidarity with the free speech movement in California in the early 1960s. But the applause that I'm talking about came sort of in January 1969. Somebody, I forget whom it was, came across from the United States and brought a film, which is a Black Panther film, sort of propaganda film, and this was shown up against the wall. Which was a white wall at the time. There was no slogan on it yet. That came hours later. And showed this Black Panther film, which ended with the 10 demands of the Black Panther Party. And some of these were sort of very ordinary demands about food and about education and the rest of it. Sort of, and the voiceover was done by some guy, I don't know who it was, but a grand, rich R&B voice. Sort of, and the 10 demands were enumerated, and the final one was, it said, 10. Up against the wall, motherfuckers. And literally, and this was an audience of young kids from the Bogside, which is the Catholic working class area in Derry that I come from, and they were literally dancing with joy and cheering. And to some extent, this was just because of the daring of the language. But it was also because this was an expression, of resistance and of a refusal to sort of a bow down. Sort of, and if you had spent the previous day fighting the cops, and the reason why you were able to show this film is that actually you had beaten the cops and driven them out of the area, then that statement sort of just intersected with your consciousness at that moment and made it thrilling and electrified it. Sort of, and that sort of a form of solidarity, that instinctive feeling of solidarity that young people had nothing really to do with anybody preaching to them about the universal nature of the struggle, sort of, or about sort of the capitalist basis of it or anything else. It was just that they knew, nobody had to tell them, that this is the same thing that people are fighting for. And therein lies sort of the great hope for the future, and the great hope of the present, and always the great hope from the past. We were walking down, my partner Goretti, who's down there somewhere, and myself, Swanton Street or something, is it? I was near where the Trades Hall, sort of as we walked past it and we were walking down this afternoon, sort of, and I'm on the Trades Council in Derry, and the Trade Union Council in Derry. So was Goretti, both of us around. And we've got, in the trade union movement, you've got little victories and big defeats, and it's up and down all the time, and so on. But we had a little victory just some couple of months ago, about 2 months ago. And that had to do with the unionisation of a call centre. In a call centre run by a crowd called Direct Force. I'm very bad at remembering these names. I think that's what they call it. But then there's 1,100 workers, mainly young people, that are in this call centre. And of course, none of them are a member of a union. They all knew they'd be sacked if they attempted to join a union. But something happened, which was that I won't go into the complications of it, but suddenly there was about 100 of them put on disciplinaries which would have resulted, or could have resulted, in their being sacked. So when we did the Trades Council with no great expectation, we had tried to unionise this place over and over again. Sort of we had sat outside it with a caravan, for days on end, trying to recruit workers, sort of with all the forms for them to fill in, join the union. Very few, but half a dozen did, and half a dozen not enough in a factory of 1,100 to have any sort of presence at all. So we had failed to do it, but suddenly this happened, and one or two of the young people who worked there, said we're going to do something about this, and contacted the Trades Council. We held a meeting for them, and to our absolute amazement, after we announced the meeting, about 200 of them turned up, and we had a little hall of a union, the Unison Union. They couldn't get into it. We had absolutely jammed out of it. And we talked to them about trade unionism in a rather pompous way, the way you do, sort of, you get the my time of day, you talk in a sort of way to young people as best you can, sort of, you talk to them, sort of, and the amazing thing was this, that they said afterwards, it's now sort of semi-unionised, and we now have union recognition. It's not formal, but we now have sort of workers being represented by trade union officials and lay officials like myself when they go in when they're in trouble with the management and so on. Absolutely unheard of in any of the call centres in the north of Ireland, but suddenly we've made that little breakthrough. But when we had this meeting sort of the workers, the most striking thing that they said is that, first of all, none of them had ever been in a union. They knew absolutely nothing about trade unions. They didn't come from families where they're overwhelmingly, so if there's any trade union history and so forth. And they said we never heard it put like that again. Little simple things, like you must stand together. If you don't stand together, so they'll be able to pick you off one by one. Join together now. Tell them that you're part of the union. Tell them sort of to contact us, not you. We'll go in, get the others to come. Get your workmates, and get your workmates to get their workmates to come and so forth. And suddenly, sort of that was on the move. Sort of, it was one of the things that I look back on. People say, what do you do in the Trades Council and so on? And to be perfectly honest, most of the time, there's not much happening. It's bureaucratic stuff. It's manoeuvring between unions. But every now and again, something happens which makes it worthwhile. And when we were walking down the street just this afternoon, we came across to our right-hand side. We're walking past. There's a sort of forecourt of some building. And there's a number of kids there, sort of red T-shirts with something written on them. When we walked past, I thought it was street theatre. And then we heard something said about call centre and unions. And we went back and said there, and they said they are the young Victorian trade unionists or some such phrase. But anyway, they were there trying to unionise call centres. And we talked to them. And it isn't just that there was a resemblance between the two situations. It was absolutely the same situation. You could have transported or transposed it sort of back to Derry, sort of, and vice versa, and it would have been the same thing. So we put all that up sort of by now, sort of, it's on Facebook, it's on theirs, it's on ours, and so forth. As everybody sort of texts people tonight and say, look at the Trades Council page on Facebook, you'll see us, we're out here, we're doing the same thing. And it's exactly the same situation. Sort of, you can see that sort of the struggle. The point I'm making sort of is that nobody planned that, of course. Obviously, it's just a coincidence. But every now and again, if you keep your eyes open as a socialist and a trade unionist, you can see sort of the way sparks that you've noticed in your own place. You see the same spark with the same potential somewhere else on the other side of the world. Sort of, and that set me thinking. I was in the trades, I mentioned the trades hall there. Trades hall, is that what you call it? That's what you call it, yeah. We're down there yesterday or the day before. Yesterday, in fact, I'm giving a little tour by Jacob. Most interesting, I'm sure most of you here sort of know Jacob. Most interesting character, very colourful account of various things that he gave us. But as he talked he just sort of talked about things that I already knew about, even though I knew nothing about Melbourne. I'd never heard of Melbourne Trades Hall before in my life. He was talking sort of about the 888. I'd never heard of that either. Sort of, the fight of stonemasons, was that 1856 or something, sort of where they struck sort of in one sort of the 8-hour day and so forth. And I was thinking sort of that the British government has just gone to the European Court, or the Court of the European Union, to try and get sort of the European Union's restriction on the working week to 48 hours, to have that set aside. People should be made to work for more than 48 hours a week, otherwise it's a restraint on trade. That's their argument. All these years later, it's the same struggle which is actually going on. And look at it in a different way. There are workers, I'm sure there's some here as well, sort of in Melbourne, as there are at home, who want to work for 8 hours a day and can't. And Sainsbury's, one of the biggest stores, shopping centres sort of in the north and in Britain, for example. Now, people want to work sort of for 8-hour shifts. They're only given 6 hours a day. And why? Because to give them a minute more would entitle them to an hour off. If you work 6 hours under the labour laws, right, you're entitled to an hour off. So they're not allowed to work for 8 hours. So in every direction, they're coming at you. Sort of in the same way as people had to fight in the middle of the 19th century. Same issue over time. Sort of over across continents, right around the world, different parts of the world, so you see the same things and the same experience. And one of the things that Jacob talked about was about the convicts who were brought out to Australia to settle Australia, and many of whom then were deployed, of course, in the genocidal enterprise against the Aboriginal people. But they had come as victims of oppression themselves. He mentioned the 6 farm workers, agricultural workers from Dorset, who in the middle of the 19th century were brought to the Tall Puddle Martyrs. Every year to this day, there's a rally at Tall Puddle, in Devon. Where Billy Bragg first sang his version of the Red Flag. So that comes from Tall Puddle. That's the right to unionise. There it was when we walked down the street today. The right to unionise and people fighting for it. And the right to unionise, the right to strike is absolutely important. Sometimes we don't understand, or we just miss how central it is. The right to organise workers and to strike. The right to walk off the job is the difference between the worker and the slave. That's what gives us dignity in our labour, and nothing else can actually do that. And that's everywhere, and that's forever. And Corey was saying about, the solidarity with the Palestinians. And all, but again, I suppose when people are sometimes embattled and fighting against their own oppression, it's natural for them to think of other people. Sometimes it's opportunist politically by the leaders of movements as well, and by governments to use and misuse feelings of solidarity. But if you were to ask me, I'm not suggesting that you, but if you were to ask me, what have you done during these years that you're proud of? The one thing that I'm proud of, which was mentioned earlier in the introduction, the one thing I'm most proud of is the part that I played in driving the Raytheon Arms Company out of Derry. Raytheon is the third biggest arms manufacturer in the United States. Oh yes, and we were part of the anti-war movement in Derry. We did the usual things. We had meetings, we had rallies, we had pickets at particular times, and this and that. And then, one time, 2006 wasn't it? Yes, it was 2006. We had a meeting of the anti-war movement. It was actually about Iraq. And we had a guy there, I'm terrible at names, I forget his name, I'll remember his name in a minute, but he was doing a tour of Ireland to speak about Iraq. He was a former interrogator at Abu Ghraib, which he had gone into innocently, as it were. He wasn't a soldier. He was part of a private company which was handling interrogation over there. And he was a Christian. He was a very devout and sincere Christian. And in the end, he walked off the job. He couldn't stand it anymore. And interestingly enough, there was no comeback, because I imagine the authorities didn't want any scandal about this Christian guy saying, I'm not going to take part in any of these interrogations anymore. But anyway, he was talking at a meeting above a pub called Sandino's. We had about 60, 70 people there. It was a big attendance for the Derry Anti-War Coalition, I can tell you. Earlier that day, a bomb had been dropped by the Israeli Defense Forces in the village of Cana, in southern Lebanon. It wasn't the first time Cana was actually hit. And this Cana's a little village of about 5,000 people. Probably the only thing people know about it is that the place in the Bible, or said to be the place in the Bible, where Jesus turned the water into wine. Although I went to Cana a little bit after that, and we told the guy who was the deputy leader of Hezbollah in the area, a religious gentleman of some nature, we told him that. He says, the only thing we know about this place before, was that Jesus turned the water into wine here. And he said immediately, not everybody believes that. But anyway, we got on well, after that. But anyway, we decided then, we knew that they had dropped a bunker buster, on this apartment building where people were hiding, had taken shelter in the basement. But a bunker buster, GBU, guided bomb unit, we knew it was a Raytheon bomb because Raytheon boasted, keeps boasting, that it was the sole supplier of bunker busters, of GBUs, to the Israeli Defense Forces. So we knew it was a Raytheon bomb. And as we discussed Iraq and Abu Ghraib, and somebody dawned almost simultaneously on everybody, wait a minute, we've just heard of this horrendous killing of ordinary innocent people. The bomb plunged right down through this apartment building into the basement where they were hiding and exploded. It blew 27 people to bits. Most of them children and women, and that, because certain men had fled or whatever, but that's where they were actively huddling. So what are we doing just sitting here discussing war in the Middle East when we've got the Raytheon factory just about a mile from Sandino's pub where we were meeting? And on the spot, it was just decided in a rush of enthusiasm and so on, we'll go down there tomorrow and occupy the fucking place. So which we did, and it was very easy to occupy, We went down, and we half intended to occupy it. The way you're throwing shapes, we'll occupy it. We had no plan, as to how we were going to do this. But we went down, a wonder of wonders. We got down there about 7:30 in the morning. It was very early for some of us. But we got down there for 7:30 in the morning, and there was a different factory, two different premises, two different workplaces in this one building. And as we were standing there, a couple of people came along, and these little fobs, that you rub a stroke against something, electronic stuff, and then the door opens. And as we were standing there, these couple of guys came along, the door opened, we made a run for it. And before we knew it, we were in. The actual premises of Raytheon. There's only one worker there, and she got up immediately and left without a word, which was terrific. So there we were in. What do we do now? What on earth do we do now? So we looked around, there were lots of computer equipment and so on. So we took all the computers and we threw them out the windows and smashed them. It was just to disable it. Then we destroyed the main frame. We first we got fire extinguishers and we hammered it with the back of the fire extinguishers. Then we turned them round and filled it with foam. And actually we discovered that not only had we taken out the dairy factory, but a sister factory in Glenrothes in Scotland immediately crashed as well. So we stopped them. So there we still didn't know what to do after we had done, because this only took 10 minutes. That's all it took. And we were sitting there, and with the doors barricaded, I thought, what next? I thought, well, we best better wait than come for us, won't they, It took them a while to arrive. And actually, when they arrived, they spoke to us through a megaphone from outside and said, hold on, don't do anything extreme. There are negotiators coming from Belfast. Negotiators? We finished on that, and the guy arrived from Belfast, and they discovered later they had flown him in on a helicopter. Because they thought, these are crazy desperados in here, there's no telling what they're going to do. But actually, the cops then come in like RoboCops. So after the negotiators, we told them, like, go away, with nothing to say to you. And they said, well, what exactly do you want? And we said, well, we want Raytheon to leave Derry. He says, I don't think I can arrange that. I said, well, we're staying then, we're not going. So after a while, after a number of hours, the cops came. You've never seen the like of it. There was 9 of us sitting there around the table, and suddenly the door starts to smash, with hammers, and then the sound of a chainsaw, cutting holes. The cops, they come in, and they're all dressed, dressed with helmets and visors and all the rest of it, and they had guns pointed at us as they came in. And they're all surrounded us. We were playing cards at the time, We were actually. I had a full house, at the time, I was very disappointed altogether. But anyway, they arrested us and took us away. And we were actually found not guilty. We admitted everything we had done. There was about £350,000 worth of damage done to Raytheon. And we argued in court. We explained that we didn't deny anything at all. We said everything you allege against us is true, but it wasn't a crime. And the reason why was we drew an analogy. The analogy was, if you're walking along the street and you're passing a house and you hear from inside the house children screaming and the sounds of violence against them. If you kick the door down and stop that happening and rescue the children, could you be charged with breaking and entering? Answer no, because you're stopping a bigger crime. That was our argument. And then they had a jury in Belfast, which wasn't, not to go into any of the detail of Northern Ireland, was not from a background that we might instinctively think was going to find in our favour, but it did unanimously after considering the matter for a number of hours. So, and when we escaped, Raytheon complained. Not a single political party, the major political parties, mainstream parties in Derry, had a single good word to say about us. They said, if I have the time, I'll just tell you something about how Raytheon came to Derry. Let's tell you something about the hypocrisy of what they call peace in a bourgeois society. That we had a peace agreement signed in Northern Ireland. I think we might go into it tomorrow with a couple of sessions, a load of bullshit, the 1998 peace agreement in Northern Ireland. But one of the attractions they said, they advertised in the peace agreement, is that there was going to be what they call a peace dividend. That now that there was peace, outside investors would take a look at Northern Ireland and say, that's a lovely place. Now it's full of peace, nice people, and we want to reward them. Because of the fact that so we'll get loads of industries to come in. So within a couple of weeks, they announced that Raytheon Systems Limited, the third biggest arms manufacturer in the United States, people who spread violence all around the world, that they were going to set up a factory in Derry to celebrate peace. So immediately you could tell, it wasn't very difficult to tell that there was something wrong here, and that's when we formed the anti-Raytheon a group. Now, so when after we had done that, they didn't go away. They complained bitterly in public about the fact that they weren't being allowed to conduct their business, and the courts weren't backing them up, etc., etc. So what we did after that, is that there was the attack in about 2 years later, was it 2008, on Gaza, by the Israeli Defense Forces, again using Raytheon munitions. And so we occupied it again. So the second time we did it was 9 women who went in, known sort of as the Raytheon women, sort of, which is a wee bit patronising maybe. But anyway, sort of that's the phrase that became popular. And after that, and they went through exactly the same experience. And they didn't even try terribly seriously to have them convicted because they were using exactly the same defence as we had used. Sort of earlier, Raytheon announced after they were acquitted that they were leaving Northern Ireland, since it was perfectly obvious that they were never going to be able to hear. So that's why I say, sort of, if anybody asks me, what are you proud of? We drove Raytheon out of Derry. We got an arms. There's a merchants of death, sort of, out of our city. And all that came simply from a simple idea, sort of solidarity, of thinking there's something happening, sort of in Lebanon or in Gaza. Is there anything practical we can do about it? And the answer was, yes, there was, so let's do it. So in those ways, sort of, you can see, sort of, as I say, over centuries and around the world, sort of, in different continents, you can see the same struggles. And everybody's related to everybody else. In a word, even if they don't know that they're we all fight for one another when we fight sort of against oppression and against exploitation. And the key to revolutionary organisation is just to link those struggles together, so that they are not, if they're just spontaneous and that's all that they are, that's fine. That's much, much better than nothing. But in order to preserve that, when we talk about a revolutionary party, we mean sort of in the classic phrase, we're talking about building the memory of the class, the memory of the struggle, drawing the lessons from all those individual struggles and linking them together and then relating them to where we are here now. If you do that, sort of, then you ensure sort of that the lessons and the excitement and all, and sometimes the crack, as we say, sort of in Ireland, that comes from various struggles, that isn't just something that goes up like a rocket and falls back to earth like a stick, that it is something that you can build on and you can use, sort of, and build on the basis that, that all these things come from the same root. The transportation of people to Australia, from Europe, from Britain and Ireland at that time. In fact, I'll end on this. I know I've gone on too long. If you ever go to a football match in Glasgow, in Parkhead, to Glasgow Celtic, which is the Irish football team in Scotland. I know that sounds a bit strange, but it is. Yeah, the song that they sing over and over again is The Fields of Athenry. And it's a song about the famine and about transportation. And the way people were sent to Australia, to Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania and all that there, for fighting back. So in the chorus of the song, if you heard it sung by 50,000 people who know what they're singing, they know what they're singing. It isn't just because it's a great song. We stole Trevelyan's corn, that the young might see the morn. Now the prison ship lies waiting in the bay. They know in Glasgow in 2015, they know what that relates to. And they sing it with gusto because they remember, sometimes in a sentimental way, but nevertheless, it's a reality. The oppression that their ancestors suffered in Ireland, which is why they're in Scotland in the first place, sort of as an immigrant community. And there you have it tied together from Australia to Scotland to Ireland, sort of in the other songs that we sing. And then reaching sort of Black Panther movies against a wall in the middle of the night in Derry. Everywhere you see us fighting for one another. Preserve that in the form of a party. And we have made the beginning at last to identifying and extirpating the real root of all these problems, which is a system of economic organisation based upon the competitive drive to accumulate against capitalism, so steeped in blood from head to foot. That's what all these struggles are about. And that's what this conference is about. And if we advance that by half an inch over the next couple of days, then we'll have done great work indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And true to my profession, I would say it's not very correct what was said here, because as a journalist, I don't really risk much. I must say, it is highly exaggerated. I live in a state, I'm a citizen of a state where there is democracy for Jews. So there isn't much, it's not like being a reporter in the ex-Soviet Union or apartheid South Africa. I don't risk much. I don't sacrifice. And it's not so much courage that I need, but there is a lot of anger. And this is what drives me, I guess. But that's with some kind of embarrassment. I feel I speak here because I am a reporter, I'm a journalist, I do write about the struggle, I do write about the occupation, but unlike you two, I don't really, I'm still, I wouldn't say outsider, but I'm not part of the struggle in that direct sense as my friends here are. So I started with this embarrassment. And in order to correct for myself the embarrassment, I can tell you about what my father told me years ago when I was returning from Gaza, visiting him in Tel Aviv. And he, to his last day, he was, I think he remained a Bolshevik. And I told him about the people I met. I told him stories. I told him, before I wrote down, I shared with him my experiences. And he said, oh yes, a people in struggle is a beautiful people. And this is one of the mottos that that are always accompanying me when I'm writing, when I'm covering the oppression, the occupation, and the struggle against it. It's not only what he said. My mother, I remember being with my mother. Maybe she was more an anarchist than a Bolshevik, but we used to watch newsreels and seeing children throwing stones. It was during the first Intifada, and she always said in Serbo-Croat, in her language, she said, "Kak slatka," how sweet. And some years before I was a journalist, I was active in Israeli left-wing groups, and I was a volunteer in a workers' advocacy group, workers' rights advocacy group. And I used to go in my car to the West Bank, occupied West Bank. It was during the first Intifada, when Palestinians threw stones at Israeli cars. So my father told me, he implored me to go by public transportation, not with my own car, because he said, if they throw stones at you with my Israeli car, they have full right to do so. So this is you could say this is the equipment with which I started to write for Haaretz and to cover the occupation. And this is why I tell people from the start, and people knew from the start, I'm not an objective journalist. There is no such thing. There is no objective journalism. We all have our opinions. We all have our set of beliefs and backgrounds. So we cannot be objective. When there is, once I told a group of feminists, very mild feminists, American feminists, who said, no offense. So they said, oh, so you are impartial or objective or something like this. And I said, listen, if I write about rape, do I have to balance between the rapist and the woman raped? So that's why when I have my starting point as a reporter is I'm not objective, not at all. Not being objective doesn't mean not to be accurate. No, on the contrary. We who claim that we cannot be objective, we have to be much more accurate than those who pretend to be objective, because actually they parrot the version of power. And because we do not parrot the version of power, we have to be very careful about the accuracy of words and facts. Nevertheless, I have dilemmas, even though I'm so sure of myself when I say I'm a non-objective journalist. I have the dilemmas of my own. And the main one is, as a journalist, as an Israeli journalist who writes for an Israeli paper, mostly to a public which belongs to the occupying and oppressing people. Do I have the right to criticize also the occupied? Because journalism is not only about reporting, it's about analysis and criticism. So do I have the right to criticize? For example, from the beginning of the Oslo process, when the Palestinian Authority was established, it was known that I'm, as part of my being non-objective, that I opposed the Oslo agreement and accords, and I saw in it a lot of, and I saw the mistakes in it, and I saw the danger in it, and expressed it. And it wasn't only directed against the Israelis, but also against those who signed it and implemented it on the Palestinian side. To such an effect that in the PA and Arafat's echelons, I heard from people that they say, oh, AMIRA incites the Palestinians against Arafat, which is completely crazy. But indeed, I did speak to people, and I saw people's distress with the unfolding agreement that only created repression and oppression of and enabled the Israeli occupation to perfect itself. And I saw the Palestinian leadership being entrenched in the privileges that Israel gave them, and the repressive measures taken against the people. Twice I was even ordered to leave the occupied territory, once from Gaza in 95 and once from the West Bank in 97. That's 2 times when I wrote explicitly against judicial measures taken by Arafat's regime against people, the death penalty within the Palestinian territory, and a military court that Arafat established. They didn't like it, but of course, at the end, they didn't kick me out, but it was annoying. Now, today, I'm asking myself, almost 20 years later, when I'm older, I say, was it a bit some sort of an arrogance that allowed me to write or to be so critical? Am I allowed as an Israeli to be so critical? I keep this open. And there is another question that I keep open, but I keep asking and I keep open. Over the years, over these 20 years, I watched the Palestinian struggle, of course. I observe, I write, I know people, I talk to people who participate in the struggle, all forms of struggles. I am guided by what my father had told me 25 years ago. A people in struggle is a beautiful people. At the same time, I watch the use of arms. I monitor the evolvement of the use of arms by Palestinians, and I cannot say that this seems to me beautiful, that everything connected to the use of arms is beautiful. I'm observing this, and I've seen this in the past, especially since the beginning of the Second Intifada in 2000. I see here a lot of competition, even a masculine competition, over whose is bigger. It's a competition between the Israeli army and the Palestinian factions, men in the Palestinian factions. I see a competition between Palestinian factions among themselves, and sometimes within the same Palestinian faction or organization, competing over whose is bigger, who is the mightier, who has the gun which can shoot more and can kill more. I see the forms in which armed groups try to establish their power internally by using the arms, by counting blood, by accumulating blood. They look for ways to strengthen their internal position within the Palestinian political arena. Their aim, as I see it, is not to gain, is not to liberate, is not to bring Palestinian people closer to liberation, but to enhance their position internally, very often. I see this use of arms the way, and I followed how slowly it alienated women from the struggle, and actually alienated and distanced women from the struggle, from participation in the struggle. How it made the popular struggle something which is completely a slogan and shared by the very few. I've seen how there is a cult of the use of arms that does not allow people to even to remember the names of activists and leaders who lead for the past 10 or 12 years the popular struggle, the unarmed popular struggle in many villages. People remember the names of armed people. They can recite them, even though I don't know what they contributed to the struggle. But they do not remember the names of people who've been in jail, whose houses are being raided every now and then, whose children are being threatened by these soldiers who raid the houses, who go with their children to the demonstrations. Their names are not known among the Palestinian public because there is a cult of the use of arms, or what's called the armed resistance. And I ask myself, indeed, when I say it, and when some people feel uncomfortable when I say these things, this criticism, I ask myself, maybe I'm blinded by the fact, maybe I'm blinded from the start because I'm an Israeli, that I cannot appreciate something, or I cannot appreciate the use of arms because I'm an Israeli. At the same time, what I answer is that I'm not only an Israeli. I don't only have one identity. I'm also a feminist, a woman and a feminist, and I'm also a leftist, somebody who was born into a leftist family, who's all my life been with leftist groups and leftist ideas and leftist way of thinking. So as a feminist and a leftist, don't I have the right also to think and to criticize the use of arms? These are the questions these are some of the dilemmas that I can raise here, and maybe when we talk, when we have another session, I can develop and give examples to more of the dilemmas. I only can say that what I have learned, that in the struggle for justice and in the struggle against repression, we need a debate, we need the exchange of different opinions, we need to allow different opinions to enrich our thinking as a guideline, as a guide to our activity. And I repeat, remember that we are not made of one identity only. We're several identities, and as leftists, as Marxists, as socialists, as internationalists, this can very often be much stronger than our national identity. Thank you.
I do not know what man is, I only know his price. It's a line from the great German socialist playwright Bertolt Brecht. I don't know whether we're performing that particular song, the Song of the Merchant, on Saturday night at the Cabaret, but that line, I reckon, expresses perfectly the ethos, or the ethics, if you want to call it that, the morality of capitalism. I do not know what man is, I only know his price. And it's one that's been rattling around my head quite a bit over the last few months in the lead up to this talk, which I'll come back to a couple of times. But I did want to start with where Rebecca started this evening, actually, just with saying what a pity it is for us that Kylie Sambo couldn't be here with us tonight. It was at Jabiluka uranium mine, actually, that I was involved in the campaign in support of the AMIRA people, which are, a bunch of people living in poverty-stricken conditions who took on one of the world's biggest mining companies and a determined government and managed to keep that uranium in the ground, together with all of their allies in the city. That was a great achievement. But Kylie Sambo and all of her people up at Muckaty in the Northern Territory, I remember about a dozen years ago it was when Brendan Nelson, the then Howard Minister for Science, went up to the Northern Territory and said, look, we want to build a nuclear waste dump somewhere up here. And his actual words were, why on earth can't people in the middle of nowhere have low-level and intermediate-level waste on their country? Just a little bit after that, his Brendan Nelson's successor, Julie Bishop, who you'd all be familiar with, she was a science minister. She went up to the Northern Territory, and her exact words, I quote, the Northern Territory sites, including Muckaty Station for this nuclear waste dump were, and I quote, some distance from any form of civilisation. And I remember what an inspiration it was to see Kylie Sambo and all of those people from that country stand up and say, we are not no one, this is not nowhere, and you are not building your nuclear waste dump on our country. And they fought, they stood up, they talked back, they formed alliances with unions, they took legal action, and a decade later, they defeated the government. So... Now, of course, that's only half the battle, or not even half the battle. The reason that nuclear waste dump was, that why some Aboriginal people actually agreed to that, was because of the systematic running down, the systematic degradation of those remote communities by successive governments in the Northern Territory. It's been an absolute inspiration just this year to see the demonstrations which have swept Australia in solidarity with the 15,000 Aboriginal people living in remote communities that are facing, demolition from that dickhead over in West Australia and his mate in Canberra. It's been an absolute inspiration. We need to, call on all of that strength and inspiration of Kylie Sambo and her comrades. There's another one who couldn't make it here tonight, again through no fault of her own, and that's a woman, Mosherefu Mishu. She is the leader of the largest left garment workers union in Bangladesh. And some people around Trades Hall and the NTU, a few people wanted to bring her over to talk about the conditions in which garment workers work in Bangladesh. And we thought, look, if she comes over, we'll definitely have her for opening night. It seems, of course, that the garments which are made in, sweatshop, I'll go into it, sweatshop is putting it kindly, the conditions that workers work in Bangladesh, those garments can cross the border without any problem at all, but when someone wants to cross a border to talk about the conditions that those workers work in, all of a sudden things get very difficult indeed, and the government didn't give her a visa. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the garment industry in Bangladesh. I went there in November. I was very privileged to be part of a trade union delegation and spent a week in Dhaka. And that line from Brecht was constantly in my head. I do not know what man is, I only know his price. And the first thing, the first day we go to a garment workers demonstration and sit down with the garment workers afterwards that try to organise their factory. The whole place has been shut down. There's 400 people out of work. They're demonstrating in the street. We sit down with a few of them, and the first thing I find out about garment workers is that they don't actually make garments. They do a collar. They do a hem. They do a pocket. They do buttons, they do a closure, they do the overlocking, they do the ironing, they do one thing again and again and again and again, every minute, every hour, 80, 120 times an hour, every day, every week. Garments is a very labour-intensive industry, possible to automate, and needs a large quantity of labour, and that labour overwhelmingly around the world and in Bangladesh today has been women's labour. And in the words of one honest Bangladeshi garment factory owner, he said, and I quote, "Women are cheaper because they have fewer options." And the colossal profits that the garment manufacturers and the retailers in the West make from this massive labour depends on how fast you drive that massive labour. They drive that labour with physical abuse, they drive that labour with verbal abuse, they drive that labour with the threat of poverty and the threat of the sack. They drive that labour until that labourer, that worker, that woman is exhausted till our eyesight is shot, and then they chuck them out and they get another one. And here's the crime. The crime is that in 2015, we can communicate around the globe in a blink of an eye or a click of a mouse. We can send goods around the globe, only a little bit slower than that. But it seems impossible to produce a shirt without grinding poverty and the most brutal exploitation. In fact, more than that, in the 21st century, it seems impossible to produce a shirt without mass murder. I went to again, privileged to meet some of the survivors of the Rana Plaza collapse, the bloodiest factory collapse, the bloodiest incident in the history of the worldwide garment industry. People might know, 2 years ago on the outskirts of Dhaka, officially 1,127 workers were crushed to death when that factory collapsed. Even that's worth sort of reflecting on. It wasn't the dark satanic mills of Britain in the 1820s and the 1830s that produced the world's worst collapse in the garment industry. It wasn't the famous sweatshops in New York a century ago that produced this monstrosity, the Triangle waist shirt fire, we know about that. It was a modern concrete building with electricity on the outskirts of a modern city in the 21st century. And people probably know at least the outline of the story, how on the 23rd of April, just 2 years ago this month, just 2 years ago this month, giant cracks opened up in the Rana Plaza factory building. People probably know that workers went to work the next day or came to outside the building and gathered round talking about, what's going to happen, what should we do, we can't go into work. People might have heard that Sohail Rana, the owner of this factory complex, he provides thugs to his tenants, the garment manufacturers, as part of the service that he provides. And these thugs are threatened and intimidated and in fact beat up workers until some thousands of them were forced into the Rana Plaza factory to make clothes for Walmart, to make clothes for Benetton, to make clothes for a dozen other global brands. People probably know at 11:15 on the 24th of April that building collapsed and 1,127 officially workers were crushed to death. And of course, most of them were young women, because women's labour is cheaper, because women have fewer options. Now, going around Dhaka for a week, you hear a lot about Rana Plaza before you even get there. You hear about the desperate sort of acts that rescuers had to perform, the incredible risks that rickshaw drivers and thousands of other workers took, surging into that building to try to rescue the dying, rescue people before the building collapsed, without regard to their own risk. We heard about the army who took 2.5 days to turn up, and all they did was keep the actual rescuers away. We heard about a woman, one of our party actually, who was with a cousin of hers, was filming night after night, bodies going into body bags. And the reason for filming them was, of course, the authorities are trying to stuff 2 or 3 bodies into a single body bag to limit the damage to brand Bangladesh. Let's lower the death toll. We can't let the truth get out. And even that, seeing the septic tank into which workers' bodies were thrown, again, to hide the bodies to minimise the death count, to minimise the damage to the Walmarts and the Benettons and the people who make their clothes. We've all heard of this race to the bottom, where every national economy is meant to underbid each national economy, give up wages and conditions and red tape and all the rest of it, We're all meant to underbid each other, This race to the bottom that happens, well, looking into that septic tank, that's the bottom. That's where the race to the bottom ends, is with workers murdered. And, the people who create the wealth of the world, the people who provide an essential service, the people who do work that cannot be replaced, the work that needs to be done, are killed wholesale and then literally thrown in with the shit. That's the bottom of the race to the bottom. But the most terrifying story I heard about Rana Plaza actually wasn't while I was there. It was after I got back, and I, still trying to write up the whole story for Red Flag newspaper, and did a bit of Googling and a whole bunch of reading, and found this quote from a woman who worked in the head office of Walmart in what's the name of the town in Arkansas somewhere, and she said, quote, "The next day, the day after the Rana Plaza collapse, when everyone knew that there was a horrific death toll, no one knew quite how big, the next day, no one said anything. So no one said anything. No one said anything about 1,127 dead. No one said anything about how it happened. No one said anything about how the hell Walmart can, help to get people out, send some aid over there. No one said anything about how can we make sure this didn't happen again. And the rest of her quote says, the only discussion was how to replace the units that were lost. I do not know what man is. I only know his price. And that's the real obscenity. That's the real obscenity. And we know the price. It's not, it's not a secret. There's groups like the Clean Clothes Campaign, there's groups around the world that have put together, a package of compensation for the many more than 1,000 dead, for the couple of thousand injured, some of them maimed for life. And they reckon that total compensation package, would amount to something like $30 million. If you break that down between the dead and the injured, it works out to about $8,000 a person, and even that is too much for the Walmarts and the Benettons and the global brands and the profiteers, companies that retail in Australia. Even that is too much to pay. That's the price. Now, to come from Dhaka to Melbourne can seem like an awful long way. And it is a long way. Workers in workplaces around Melbourne don't face mass slaughter on that sort of a scale. It's just undeniable. It's a long way from Dhaka to Melbourne. That race to the bottom, despite the best efforts of our government and our capitalists, we are far from at the bottom of the race to the bottom. But there's still a price on life. Like just 2 years ago, the very day that this conference opened, just a few weeks before Rana Plaza collapsed, was a windy day in Melbourne. And people might remember the tragedy that unfolded up on Swanston Street, where a wall was toppled over by a gust of wind and 3 people were crushed. And people from Melbourne would probably know that Daniel Grollo, the notorious anti-union construction boss, his company was recently in court as a result of those deaths. And he put his hand up, he said, yeah, that was my wall. Or his lawyer put his hand up for him. He said, yes, that was my wall. Yes, we got some subcontractor to, erect this enormous sign on this unsupported, very old brick wall. The sign was much higher. Yes, that sign acted like a sail when the wind hit it. No, we didn't do any engineering standards or any engineering studies at all. Yes, that was my wall that toppled over. And he got a fine, guilty as, for $83,000 per person, a total of $250,000. Now, just a few months before that, the construction union, the CFMEU, had put on a blockade in central Melbourne against the dodgy safety practices on Grocon, on Daniel Grollo's construction sites. And we blockaded one of his main sites for 2 weeks. It was fantastic to be part of it. 2,000 construction workers turning up every morning, day after day after day. It was totally peaceful, pushed back a few horses, police horses from time to time, but, it was amazing. No, stubbed toe was probably the worst injury. The fine that the union got for that was $1.25 million. Wow. Now, so you work out the maths. The construction union could have murdered a dozen people. They'd still have loose change. They'd still have change after it. So that's that. Okay, the scale of it is different, Bangladesh to Melbourne, but the logic is exactly the same. The crime, as far as capitalism is concerned, isn't the destruction of human life, wholesale, retail, slow, fast, whatever. No, that's just business as usual. The real crime is getting in the way of that business as usual. That's the biggest crime that you can commit under capitalism. I do not know what man is. I only know his price. But of course, in Australia, we're told not to worry about it. We're told this is as good as it gets. We're told this is the country that has dodged the great financial crisis. This is the country that has had 23 years, unprecedented, first world country with 23 years, continuous economic growth. We keep on being told this is as good as it gets. And the scary thing is that that's true. This is as good as it gets. There's no country in the world that has a record of economic growth from such a high base as Australia does. This is as good as it gets. And so it's interesting to have a look around. As Rebecca said, my day job when I'm, not trying to get my head around Bangladesh is industrial organiser for Socialist Alternative. So I get to hear a few stories. I'd like to hear more stories all the time. I wish we organised in more places. But just within the space of a month or so, from a fairly small sample, we've got A friend of mine, a construction worker who's been to a couple of socialist alternative events, lucky to be alive with a totally smashed leg after lifting a badly packed load, at a dodgy, construction site. Another comrade, hopefully Richard will be here, a lot over the weekend, raises safety concerns in the same week, construction worker, ends up getting sacked. Another comrade, I don't know whether people are here tonight from one of the warehouses that we're organising out in Laverton, and just with a little stroke of the pen, the Woolworths management just sort of decide to turn the screws on how hard people have to work in this liquor warehouse. They have this arbitrary thing called 100%. You're picking 100%, you've got to pick 100%. Let's sack a couple of people just sort of randomly to instill fear into the workforce, to make sure that people pick 100%. Overnight almost, the rate of injury in that place skyrockets from, a handful of people, half a dozen people on return to work sort of issues, on work cover issues, injured at work. You go to, 20 or 30 or even more, just at the stroke of the pen. This is as good as it gets. All of this is as good as it gets. This is from a small sample. I could go on and on, The comrade who I had to sit with, work cover hassles again, with his bar owner, his smirking bar owner, sort of, butter wouldn't melt in his mouth when he's explaining why he left our comrade with no food in the fridge because he suspended payments just because he felt like it over Christmas, Melbourne's fabulous bar scene, brought to you by super-exploited Nepalese labour and broken bodies, This is as good as it gets. That's before we even get to the health and education system. In a system which, didn't put a price on everything, in a system which, put humanity at its centre. Of course, health, housing, education, all these things would be, the highest standard that we could possibly achieve. In a system which only knows the price of things, of course, this gets seen as, this is a little bit of a high fixed cost. We'd better reduce that to a low fixed cost. We'd better, cut the health budget. I've got an even better idea. Let's turn that into a source of profit for some of us. Yeah, that's a great idea. Then that has turning health into a source of profit, turns health into a source of fear. Because people know, shit, I'm one serious injury away, I'm one back injury away from, not being looked after, being stuck in this, system that can't look after me and so on. And this is as good as it gets. This is as good as it gets. That's before we even get to 150 remote communities. That's before we get to the gulags in Manus and Nauru, turning torture into profit for Transfield. That's before we get to the endless wars. Who are we at war with this week? Eurasia or something? This is as good as it gets. Each generation in Australia has to work harder and longer than the last generation, and this is as good as it gets. Now, of course, tonight's panel is called Voices of Resistance, and going to Bangladesh was certainly an education in resistance because, I was in a bunch of unions, I've been on a shitload of picket lines, I was in the Victorian construction industry for a dozen years. I've met plenty of tough fighters in my time, but meeting some Bangladeshi garment workers, that is a new definition of tough for me. Because of the level of repression, because of the level of corruption in the place, it is very hard to have a stable union in the sort of way that we have here in Melbourne. But when there's 4 or 5 million of you, when you earn 80% of the country's foreign exchange, it's possible to get out on the street, then the cops come in, and then you call your comrades from the next factory, and then you go to the highway, and then they call the army in, and then it goes nationwide, and then people start burning factories down. You shut the whole country down. They did it in 2006, and they won a 60% increase in the minimum wage. They did it in 2013 after the Rana Plaza collapse. They won a 77% increase in the minimum wage. It's possible to shut the country down. That was a pretty inspiring piece of resistance. But of course, it's not enough. Because every single cent that the workers got in a pay rise, as soon as they get it, the boss is trying to grab it back off them by saying, you don't do 100 collars anymore, you do 140. You don't do this number of buttons, you get the picture, and the landlords and so on. So resistance, we live on resistance. Without, just trace elements of resistance, can keep you going for ages. We crave that stuff, it's what we live for, but it's not enough. And it's a contention of socialist alternative that we need Marxism. And the best definition of Marxism that I've ever come across is the theory and the practice of working class revolution. That's the point of us as an organisation, and that's the point of this conference. So I guess I want to finish just by sort of breaking that down a little. The working class, because, well, last time I checked, it is still the working class that do all the damn work on the planet. It's us that build all of the factories, it's us that staff all of the offices, it's us that do all of the, that make all of the garments, that do all of the essential work in all of the hospitals, in all of the schools, We do all of the work already. The working class, because we don't have an interest in the wars, in the profit mongering, in the mass slaughter, in all of the oppression that the capitalist system breeds. And the working class, because we have the power to actually work out how to make a shirt without bloodshed and misery. We can actually create a system where it's based on not the price of blood, not the price of a shirt, not the price of labour, but actually on what human beings need. That's why the working class. The revolution, because the only way we're going to get that is through a revolution. The Benettons and the Walmarts and the Gina Reinhardts and the Daniel Grollos and all, the smirking bar owner and all the rest of it aren't going to just, fair enough, we've had a good run, see you later. It will take a revolution to get rid of them, and it will take a revolution to get rid of the muck of ages which has accumulated during their rule. That's why revolution, and there's plenty, and I should be saying, that's why there's so much at this conference about revolutionary struggle. That's why there's so much at this conference about the, working class, about the class itself, about our organisation, about our history, about our politics and traditions, about the debates that have gone on. Where are we up to? The practice, the practice, well, there's plenty of practice here. We've got people who have, been witness to and part of movements that have shaken governments and even shaken empires. Emory Douglas from the Black Panthers, Anand Gopal, who's, I don't know how many uprisings and revolutions he's been witness to. AMIRA HASS, EAMONN McCANN, we're not lacking in terms of, the practice of struggle here at this conference. And theory, of course, because we can't change the world without a theory of the world. You take all of that practice, you take all of that struggle, you take all of that experience, you try to distill it, draw some lessons out, that's why we have theory. And that ranges from the building blocks of Marxism, some of the most essential sessions that we've got this weekend, to some of the foundations of Marxist philosophy, Western political thought, and so on. So, I'm hoping that the whole weekend will be, I'm sure that the whole weekend will be a school of struggle, a struggle for a world where the workers who produce the wealth actually control the wealth. Struggle for a world where health and education and housing are seen as essential prerequisites for, the fulfilment of our humanity, not as something as a high fixed cost to be cut or turned into a source of gnawing fear and anxiety, while we're told that it's the best that we can get. Struggle for a world, of course, where we can finally produce a shirt without the stench of blood and poverty. A world governed by humanity and our needs, not by the price of labour or blood or a shirt. That's a world worth fighting for. It's a world worth organising for. It's a world worth wrapping your head around some history and some theory for. It's a world worth committing your time and energy and your passion for fighting for. So ahead of a whole weekend full of discussion, debate, inspiration, controversy, I've got one thing left to say, which is welcome to Marxism.